To remain updated with the latest business news, click on the bell icon.
Several technology angles in this war between Ukraine and Russia, and there's a global angle as well. Just to understand this a little better, I'm now joined by Nadiya Kostyuk from the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's a researcher and someone who's been studying this space for nearly a decade now, specifically Russian operations, cyber operations in Ukraine. Nadiya, thanks so much for joining us on this special broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
Nadiya, when we really zoom in on this situation, Ukraine's cybersecurity authority has actually come out and said that they're fighting the world's first hybrid war. Now, if we just try to analyze the nature and scale of what's happening in the region, and that's a place that you're no stranger to. You're from Ukraine and now you're in the US, and you've been studying this space and Russia's actions over there. Would you agree that this is the world's first hybrid war?
So I think over the last few decades, how wars have been fought have been affected by the modern technology. And cyber technology is one of these modern technologies. So since the start of the conflict in Ukraine in 2014, we've seen an extensive use of cyber operations. Unfortunately, they haven't been as effective. So as a result, now we see that Russia has to use military operations to achieve a strategic advantage. Despite that, we've seen still and some substantial use of cyber operations. But I would stress that the most important aspect so far, if we think about the digital space, is the disinformation and influence operations that Russia has been launching for some time.
Nadia, since you've been studying this space for a while, I think this happened back during the incursions in Georgia and then, of course, in Crimea as well. Has the Russian operation evolved over the years? Now, we're talking about a world where there's cryptocurrencies are the talk of the town. And of course, there's 5G and all sorts of AI and Internet of Things. Has the Russian cyber operation, these attacks, has the nature of these attacks changed over the last few years of your research?
Absolutely. They are changing and they are amending, but it also depends on the target. Right? If we think about sort of what do we have in Ukraine or Georgia or other post-Soviet Union countries, the attacks are not as sophisticated as they are, for instance, against the US or any Western countries. And the reason they are not as sophisticated because the targets are not as sophisticated. So if we think even about the evolution of cyber attacks in Ukraine, they were very sort of, I wouldn't call them primitive, but they didn't require a lot of sort of expertise and time to prepare because in 2014, Ukraine wasn't ready for any cyber operations. Also, Ukraine relied on Russia's infrastructure. So Russia didn't have to invest a lot of time and money to do something to disrupt the services. But if we think about Russian attacks against the US critical infrastructure or even the Russian interference into the US elections, the campaigns are much more sophisticated because the target is, and also the defenses of the target are. So I would say everybody is catching up, but also Russia in particular, they're very flexible in how they come up with a particular operation depending on the specifics of the target, which is a very smart move.
Nadia, but you know, the commentators and the researchers and the cybersecurity community were all talking over the past few weeks about a full-scale cyber war, and Russia really flexing its cyber military and cyber warfare muscle, so to speak, to actually launch a full-scale war. Is it already here? Is it coming? What do you think the Russians are planning next, or is it all entirely offline now? And this was just a little more, well, a precursor to the real war, which is now being fought on the battlefield? Or will this continue the cyber warfare or the hybrid warfare, so to speak?
So I disagree with that point of view. And I think the reason for it is very obvious. Russia has been using cyber operations against Ukraine since 2014. And the reason Russia needed to place the troops and now Russia use full-blown invasion in Ukraine is because cyber attacks are not effective. Cyber attacks didn't allow Russia to achieve its strategic objectives. So that's why I needed to use cyber force. But also, if we analyze and look at the cyber operations that have been done since the start of the conflict, or even since the time when Russia put the troops on the Ukrainian border, they were not very effective. We had some distributed denial of service attacks against the Ukrainian government websites. Again, they disrupted some work of these websites for a few hours, but then the services were quickly restored. I think the most important part of the sort of cyber front that we have seen so far is the disinformation influence operations that Russia has put over the last few weeks. And we can see how important this aspect of the Russian campaign is from its recent law that the Russian government implemented against the so-called the spread of fake news by media, and as a result of which any media sources that promotes any narrative that is different from the one of the Russia's Ministry of Defense could have up to 15 years of jail time. I think that is the key, and that is the main sort of place where Russia puts its efforts in cyberspace.
And also, Nadiya, in terms of the Ukrainian people, we've seen this throughout our coverage here on India Today. There's that spirit of resilience, and you'd understand it really well in terms of how the Ukrainians have fought back. It also translates in the digital world because the Ukrainians haven't taken all of this lying down. I know the IT army, which they've come up with, is this sort of cyber resistance force. Also, we've seen hacking collectives coming up as well. They've come up as countermeasures to some of these actions by the Russians. So Ukrainians aren't taking this lying down, right? They're fighting back quite effectively online as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of resistance from the sort of Ukrainians that are part of the government institutions. We know that the US and the UK cyber warfare teams are helping them. And I was mildly sort of surprised and impressed of how resilient the Ukrainian cyber defenses are. Again, comparing with 2014 when the conflict had started. But also there is a lot of support from the various hacking groups from the Ukrainian diaspora, but also not only Ukrainians. And we've heard about various cyber operations against various government and non-government facilities in Russia. The only problem with these non-state attacks, the attacks by the hacking group, is that it's very hard in the cyberspace sort of to differentiate whether it's a non-state hacking group that is doing it or whether it's the government. And so some experts say that if it's not possible to distinguish, the Russia can take that the government, particularly Western governments, are sponsoring some of these attacks. And the result, it can escalate and hack back some of the Western nations.
Nadiya, we cover technology here on Tech Today, and this is obviously a very complex situation, but you have family in Ukraine as well, and in the connected world that we live in, we all want to stay in touch with family. I've heard from some of my friends in Ukraine and in the region that a lot of them have left Telegram, the messaging app, and they're using Signal and other end-to-end encrypted platforms. Has that been an issue? And do you think that a lot of locals and residents in the area, in and around where you come from, a lot of them have been using other forms of social media to actually crowdsource things and actually help out? Because I have friends even over here in India who are using social media quite effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. They are using various sort of communication depending on their technological level. So, for instance, my grandma, obviously, she hasn't switched any of her routine. We are using Viber for communication, and luckily there hasn't been any internet shutdowns or anything like that, or mobile or telecommunications shutdown. So, I've been easily communicating with her. But also some of my sort of, I would say, younger friends and family members, they're using various modes of communications depending on the level of security that they care for, right? So they can use some of the encrypted messages, as you mentioned, WhatsApp and Signal. Some of them, they continue relying on social media, such as Facebook. Some of them continue using email.
Nadiya, thanks so much for sharing all those inputs and insights. We hope your family stays safe and everyone stays safe from this war being fought not only offline, but also online.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.